They crowned her the Virgin Queen, a woman who chose duty over marriage, who ruled England through its golden age. But what if Elizabeth I wasn't a woman at all? What if the greatest monarch in British history was actually a red-haired boy from a remote village, living a lie that lasted 45 years? In 1870, they found a child's coffin buried in a garden, and what was inside explains why her tomb has remained sealed for over 400 years. This is the dark secret they've been hiding since 1543. Picture this. The year is 1895, and Bram Stoker, the man who gave the world Dracula, walks into a sleepy English village, expecting nothing more than quaint countryside charm. Instead, he witnesses something that would consume him for the rest of his life. In the village of Bisley, tucked away in the Cotswold Hills of Gloucestershire, the annual May Day celebration is in full swing. But something is drastically wrong with this picture. Every village in England crowns a young girl as their May Queen, adorning her with flowers and celebrating feminine beauty. Every village except Bisley. Here they dress a boy in elaborate Elizabethan costume, complete with a gown, jewels, and a crown. Not as a joke, not as a modern twist. This tradition had been practiced for over 300 years. Stoker couldn't shake the question that burned in his mind. Why would this remote village have such a bizarre custom? What historical event could possibly justify dressing a boy as a Tudor-era queen, year after year, generation after generation? The local villagers, when pressed, shared a legend so explosive that Stoker would dedicate an entire chapter of his book, Famous Impostors, to investigating it. They told him that their strange tradition commemorated an actual event, a secret so dangerous that it had been hidden in plain sight for centuries, disguised as harmless folklore. Stoker wasn't just some conspiracy theorist with too much time on his hands. He was a meticulous researcher, the personal assistant to Henry Irving, one of the most famous actors of the Victorian era, and a man who understood the importance of verifying sources before making wild claims. Irving himself had first stumbled upon the Bisley Boy legend while house hunting in the Cotswolds, and the story intrigued him so much that he passed it directly to Stoker, knowing his assistant's talent for investigation. What Stoker uncovered through months of research, interviews with elderly villagers, and examination of fragmentary historical records would either make him look like a genius or completely destroy his credibility. The legend claimed that England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and presided over the Elizabethan Golden Age, was not the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn at all. According to the people of Bisley, the real Princess Elizabeth had died in their village as a child in 1543, and a local red-haired boy had taken her place. This boy had then lived as Elizabeth for the rest of his life, fooling the entire kingdom for 45 years. If true, it meant that one of the most powerful women in history was actually a man. It meant the Tudor dynasty had ended not with a queen, but with an impostor. It meant that centuries of English history had been built on a lie so audacious that nobody had ever seriously questioned it. Stoker published his findings in 1910, and the reaction was explosive. Some historians dismissed it as absurd fiction, impossible to believe. Others found themselves unable to explain away certain disturbing facts that aligned perfectly with the legend. The May Day tradition itself was undeniable evidence that something significant had happened in Bisley, involving a boy dressed as a girl. These customs didn't emerge from nowhere. They commemorated real events, passed down through generations when most people couldn't read or write. The villagers had been keeping this memory alive for over 3 centuries through their annual celebration, hiding the truth in plain sight where anyone could see it but few would understand it. As Stoker dug deeper, he found himself asking an increasingly uncomfortable question. What if this insane story was actually true? What if the woman who had shaped the destiny of an empire, who had never married despite desperate pressure, who had kept her body hidden behind layers of makeup and elaborate costumes, had been concealing the most explosive secret in royal history? But to understand how such an impossible deception could have succeeded, you need to know what happened in 1543 when a 10-year-old princess was sent away to escape death and instead found it waiting for her in the Cotswold countryside. London in 1543 was a city of death. The bubonic plague had returned with a vengeance, and every day brought fresh horrors. Black swellings appeared on necks and groins, fevers burned through entire households, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The streets reeked of decay and burning tar, futile attempts to purify the poisoned air. Wealthy families fled to the countryside, abandoning their London estates for remote manor houses where they prayed the pestilence wouldn't follow. Among those sent away was 10-year-old Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, a child whose legitimacy was constantly questioned and whose position in the royal succession remained uncertain. Her father, King Henry VIII, had already declared her a bastard, then partially restored her to the line of succession, creating a legal confusion that would haunt her entire childhood. Nevertheless, she was still a princess, still royal blood, and her life was valuable enough to protect from the plague ravaging London. Her governess, Lady Cat Ashley, and her guardian, Sir Thomas Parry, were given explicit orders. Take Elizabeth to Overcourt House in the village of Bisley, keep her safe, keep her healthy, and above all, keep her alive. The Cotswold Hills were remote, the air was clean and sweet, and the village had reported no cases of plague. It seemed like the perfect sanctuary. Overcourt House was a former royal hunting lodge, a substantial building with thick stone walls and mullioned windows that overlooked the rolling Gloucestershire countryside. Elizabeth settled into her temporary home with her small household, which included her tutors, servants, and her closest companions. Among these was a local boy from the village, the son of minor gentry, who had red hair similar to Elizabeth's distinctive Tudor coloring. The children played together in the gardens, studied their lessons, and enjoyed the peaceful rural life so different from the dangerous intrigue of the royal court. For weeks, everything seemed perfect. The princess thrived in the country air, her health remained robust, and Lady Ashley sent regular reports back to London, assuring the king that his daughter was flourishing. Then, without warning, disaster struck with devastating speed. Elizabeth fell violently ill with what contemporary records describe as an acute fever. Within days, she was bedridden, burning up with temperature, unable to keep down food or water. The local physicians were summoned, but their primitive treatments, bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies did nothing to break the fever. Lady Ashley watched in mounting horror as the child under her care grew weaker by the hour. Elizabeth's red hair darkened with sweat, her skin became clammy and pale, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Then, before anyone could react or send for more skilled physicians from London, the young princess stopped breathing. The exact cause of death remains unknown to this day. Some versions of the legend claim it was the plague after all, that the disease had followed them from London like a curse. Others suggest a sudden infection, perhaps appendicitis or some other internal catastrophe that 16th century medicine had no hope of treating. A few darker whispers hint at poisoning, though no evidence has ever surfaced to support such an accusation. What matters is that Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII, third in line to the English throne, died at Overcourt House in Bisley while still a child. Her body lay cooling in an upstairs chamber while Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry stood frozen in absolute terror. They had been given one job: keep the princess alive. They had failed, and now they had to face the consequences of that failure. The problem was that the consequences meant certain death. Henry VIII was not a forgiving man. He had recently executed his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, for adultery, sending her to the block with barely a second thought. He had destroyed Thomas Cromwell, his most trusted advisor, on fabricated charges. He had broken with the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and executed anyone who opposed him. His paranoia and rage had only intensified with age and illness. If Henry learned that his daughter had died while under their care, Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry knew exactly what would happen. They would be arrested, charged with negligence or worse, and they would die. Probably by beheading if they were lucky, by hanging, drawing, and quartering if Henry's fury was particularly intense. But here's where the nightmare became even worse. A messenger arrived at Overcourt House with news that made Lady Ashley's blood run cold. King Henry VIII was on his way to Bisley to visit his daughter. He would arrive within a day, perhaps two at most. The king was traveling through the region and had decided, on a whim, to stop and see how Elizabeth was faring in the countryside. He expected to find his daughter healthy, happy, and ready to greet him with appropriate ceremony. Instead, he would find a corpse. There was no time to send word ahead, no time to prepare him for the devastating news, no time to craft explanations or beg for mercy. Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry looked at each other in the chamber where Elizabeth's body lay and made a decision that would change the course of English history. They would not tell the king his daughter was dead. They would hide Elizabeth's body and present him with a substitute. It was an insane plan, born of pure desperation and terror with almost no chance of success. But it was the only plan they had. The alternative was certain execution, so they had nothing to lose by trying. They wrapped Elizabeth's body quickly and hid it temporarily in a storage room. Then began the frantic search for a replacement child who could pass as the princess, at least long enough to fool Henry during a brief visit. They needed a child around 10 years old with fair skin, delicate features, and most crucially, red hair. Elizabeth's Tudor red hair was her most distinctive feature inherited from her father. Without it, any substitution would be immediately obvious. Lady Ashley sent servants racing through the village of Bisley with urgent, desperate instructions. Find every child in the area who might possibly match Elizabeth's appearance. The servants knocked on doors, searched through market squares, questioned families, growing more frantic with each passing hour. They found blonde children, brown-haired children, children too old, children too young. They found girls with red hair who were too tall, too short, too dark-complexioned. None of them would work. Henry VIII had seen his daughter, albeit infrequently and usually from a distance, but he had seen her. He knew her face, her coloring, her general size and bearing. Any substitution had to be at least superficially convincing, or the deception would fail instantly. As the sun began to set on that terrible day, Lady Ashley faced the horrible truth. There was not a single girl in Bisley or the surrounding area who could pass as Princess Elizabeth. The plan had failed before it even began. They would have to confess everything to the king and pray for a mercy they knew he would never grant. Then someone remembered the boy. Elizabeth's playmate, the red-haired child from the village who had spent weeks playing with the princess in the gardens of Overcourt House. He was the right age, the right height, and most importantly, he had that distinctive Tudor red hair. There was just one absolutely catastrophic problem. He was male, but what choice did they have? It was either dress a boy as a girl and hope the king didn't notice, or confess to the death and die for certain. Lady Ashley made the call. They would use the boy. The boy's name, according to various versions of the legend, was Neville, though some accounts dispute this detail. What makes this part of the story particularly intriguing is the claim put forward by Bram Stoker and others that this boy was not just some random village child. He was allegedly the illegitimate grandson of Henry VIII himself. The theory goes like this. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, was Henry VIII's acknowledged bastard son by his mistress Elizabeth Blount. Fitzroy died young in 1536, but before his death he had allegedly fathered a son with Mary Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This son would have been kept quiet, hidden away in the countryside as illegitimate children of illegitimate children often were. But he would have carried Henry VIII's blood, and, crucially, his distinctive red hair and facial features. If this boy was indeed Henry's grandson through the illegitimate line, it would explain several things that make the Bisley Boy legend slightly less impossible than it first appears. It would explain why the boy could convincingly pass as Elizabeth at all. He would have had genuine family resemblance, the same basic bone structure, the same coloring, the same Tudor features that made the royal family recognizable. It would explain why the boy was educated enough to eventually function as a monarch. Illegitimate royal grandchildren were often given decent educations, kept in reserve in case dynastic emergencies required their use. And it would explain why the boy would have been in Bisley at all, living near Overcourt House in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time to become part of this desperate substitution. Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry moved with desperate speed. They took the boy into Elizabeth's private chambers and locked the doors. They stripped him of his boy's clothing and dressed him in the princess's elaborate gowns, layer after layer of silk and velvet and brocade. They fitted him with Elizabeth's jewelry, her rings and necklaces and brooches. They styled his red hair to match the princess's usual appearance, covering any differences with a headdress. They coached him frantically on how to stand, how to curtsy, how to address his supposed father. The boy, terrified and confused, did what he was told. Perhaps he understood the stakes. Perhaps they threatened him. Perhaps he was simply too young to fully grasp what was happening. Whatever his reasons, he cooperated with the deception. They had less than a day to prepare him. Less than a day to transform a village boy into a princess, convincing enough to fool one of the most dangerous men in England. The next morning, when King Henry VIII arrived at Overcourt House with his retinue, Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry presented him with his daughter. The moment must have been absolutely terrifying. Henry dismounted from his horse, swept into the house with his characteristic energy despite his increasing age and infirmity, and called for Elizabeth. The boy in a dress walked forward, executed a curtsy exactly as he had been taught, and kept his eyes lowered in the modest, shy demeanor expected of a young princess in the presence of her father. Henry VIII looked at the child, and he saw nothing wrong. How is this possible? How could a king fail to recognize that his own daughter had been replaced with a completely different child? The answer lies in the nature of Tudor parenting, or particularly royal parenting. Henry VIII was not a hands-on father. He had seen Elizabeth only a handful of times in her entire life, usually at formal occasions where she would be presented to him briefly before being removed back to her own household. Royal children in the 16th century were raised separately from their parents, with their own servants, tutors, and residences. Henry had 3 legitimate children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, and he spent very little time with any of them. He knew what Elizabeth looked like in a general sense. Red hair, pale skin, small for her age. But he didn't know her intimately, couldn't have identified her by specific facial features, wouldn't have noticed subtle differences in voice or mannerisms. Furthermore, Henry was in a hurry during his visit to Bisley. He wasn't there for an extended stay or deep conversation with his daughter. He was passing through the region, stopped briefly to check on Elizabeth's well-being, saw that she appeared healthy and appropriately respectful, and then left to continue his journey. The entire visit probably lasted less than an hour. It was exactly the kind of brief, formal interaction that made the substitution possible. The boy kept his head bowed, spoke only when spoken to, and gave the performance of his life. And it worked. Henry left Overcourt House believing he had seen his daughter, never suspecting that Elizabeth was already dead and hidden somewhere in the building. But here's where the deception should have ended. Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry could have waited for Henry to leave, then sent word to London that Elizabeth had died shortly after the king's visit. They could have claimed sudden illness, another fever, a tragic but not suspicious death. The king would have been angry perhaps, but probably wouldn't have blamed them for an illness that struck. After his own visit confirmed the princess was healthy, they would have been off the hook. Instead, according to the legend, they made a far more audacious decision. They chose to continue the deception permanently. The boy who had fooled Henry VIII once would continue living as Princess Elizabeth indefinitely. Why would they make such an insane choice? One theory is that they were already in too deep. Once they had actively deceived the king by presenting a substitute child, they had committed treason. If they now revealed the truth, they would still be executed, not for negligence in Elizabeth's care, but for deliberately lying to the monarch. Another theory suggests they became convinced the deception could actually work long-term. The boy had fooled Henry. Perhaps he could fool everyone. And if he could maintain the disguise until adulthood, he could actually become monarch. And as queen, he could protect Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry from any consequences. They would be the closest confidants of the sovereign, untouchable. Whatever their reasoning, they took the real Elizabeth's body and buried it hastily in a stone coffin in the garden at Overcourt House, beneath a window where she had spent her last days looking out at the Cotswold Hills. The boy, meanwhile, had to become Elizabeth in every meaningful way. This wasn't just a matter of wearing dresses and learning to curtsy. He had to study Elizabeth's handwriting and learn to forge her signature. He had to master her mannerisms, her way of speaking, her preferences and dislikes. He had to become fluent in the languages Elizabeth had been learning: Latin, Greek, French, Italian. He had to study the same subjects, read the same books, develop the same intellectual interests. Most critically, he had to learn how to think like Elizabeth, how to react to situations the way she would have reacted, how to maintain relationships with people who had known the real princess. This was not something that could be accomplished in a few days or even weeks. Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry kept Elizabeth in Bisley for over a year before returning to court, claiming the country air was so beneficial they wanted to extend the stay. During that year, they transformed the boy into Princess Elizabeth as completely as was humanly possible. They also ensured his absolute loyalty and silence. The boy knew that revealing the truth meant death, not just for himself, but for Lady Ashley and Thomas Parry, the only people protecting him. He was trapped in the role whether he wanted to continue or not. By the time they returned to London, the substitution was complete. The boy who had once played with Princess Elizabeth in the gardens of Overcourt House was now Princess Elizabeth. And nobody suspected a thing because nobody was looking for deception. Why would they? The idea that someone would replace a royal child with a completely different person was too absurd to even consider. Years passed and the boy grew into adolescence and then adulthood, always living as Elizabeth, never revealing the secret that could destroy everything. When Edward VI died in 1553, Mary I took the throne and Elizabeth found herself imprisoned in the Tower of London, suspected of treason against her half-sister. If there was ever a moment when the deception might have been exposed, this was it. Elizabeth was interrogated, examined, kept under constant surveillance. Yet the secret held. When Mary died childless in 1558, Elizabeth ascended to the throne as Elizabeth I, Queen of England. and now the stakes became impossibly high. As a princess, exposure would have meant disgrace and probably death. As queen, exposure would mean the collapse of the entire English government. Everything Elizabeth did as monarch had to be calculated to protect the secret. And this is where the Bisley Boy theory becomes genuinely compelling, because it explains so many of Elizabeth's otherwise bizarre behaviors. It explains why she refused to marry despite overwhelming pressure from every direction. Kings and princes from across Europe proposed to her. Her own parliament begged her to take a husband and produce an heir. Her counselors, particularly William Cecil, spent decades pleading with her to marry before it was too late. Elizabeth always had excuses ready. This suitor was too old, that one was too young, this prince was Catholic, that duke was insufficiently powerful. She promised she would marry soon. Always soon, never now. Historians have proposed numerous explanations over the centuries. Perhaps she was traumatized by watching her father destroy his wives. Perhaps she enjoyed the political power that came with remaining single. But the Bisley Boy theory offers a simpler explanation. Elizabeth couldn't marry because any husband would discover the truth on the wedding night. Consider what marriage meant in the 16th century. A royal marriage required consummation, and consummation meant physical intimacy that would instantly reveal any anatomical deception. There was no way for Elizabeth to marry without being exposed as male. This wasn't something that could be hidden with clever clothing or dim lighting. The truth would come out, and when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. The husband would be in a position to either reveal the secret, destroying Elizabeth and probably seizing power for himself, or blackmail the queen for the rest of her life. Neither option was acceptable. So Elizabeth chose the only path available. She transformed her inability to marry into a virtue. She became the Virgin Queen, married to England itself rather than to any mortal man. She cultivated an image of herself as a semi-divine figure who had sacrificed personal happiness for her country. She used her perpetual availability as a diplomatic weapon, dangling the possibility of marriage before foreign powers for decades while never actually committing to anyone. It was a brilliant strategy that kept potential enemies negotiating instead of fighting, but it was also born of absolute necessity. The same logic applied to having children. Pregnancy was obviously impossible for someone biologically male, which meant Elizabeth could never produce an heir no matter how desperately England needed one. She couldn't even fake a pregnancy the way some queens had attempted. Any such charade would eventually require producing a baby, which was impossible. So instead, she simply refused to engage with the question, changing the subject whenever succession was mentioned, promising to deal with it later. Always later, never now. But what about Robert Dudley? The man Elizabeth clearly loved. The one person she might have genuinely wanted to marry if marriage had been possible. Their relationship becomes even more tragic through the lens of the Bisley Boy theory. Dudley was Elizabeth's childhood friend, imprisoned in the Tower at the same time she was, someone who knew her before she became queen. If anyone might have known the truth, it would have been Dudley. Some versions of the legend suggest that Dudley did know, that Elizabeth confided in him at some point, perhaps during their time in the Tower when they were both facing possible execution, and secrets seemed less important. If Dudley knew the truth, it would explain the strange dynamic of their relationship. They were obviously in love. Everyone at court could see it. Foreign ambassadors wrote scandalous reports about the way Elizabeth looked at her master of the horse, the way they danced together, the hours they spent alone in private chambers. Yet they never married, even when it became politically feasible to do so. The conventional explanation is that Dudley's first wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances in 1560, falling down a staircase and breaking her neck. If Elizabeth married Dudley immediately after, it would look like they had conspired to murder Amy. So they waited for the scandal to fade. But it faded. Years passed, and still Elizabeth didn't marry Dudley. Why not? The Bisley Boy theory suggests that Dudley knew marriage was impossible because he knew Elizabeth's secret. He loved the person inside the royal disguise, but he also understood that they could never have a conventional relationship. So he remained at court, as close to Elizabeth as he could be without marriage, sharing a bond that nobody else could quite understand. Late in his life, Dudley allegedly wrote a letter that has since been destroyed, but whose contents were recorded by contemporaries who read it before it vanished. In this letter, he referred to a secret that bound him and Elizabeth together throughout their lives, a secret that was a source of sorrow rather than joy. What could this secret have been if not the truth about Elizabeth's identity? The letter was destroyed after Dudley's death, probably by Elizabeth herself or by those protecting her interests, ensuring that even this hint of the truth would not survive. If Dudley did know the secret, he took it to his grave, dying in 1588 without ever betraying the person he loved. Elizabeth's grief at his death was intense and genuine. She locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing to see anyone or conduct any business. Perhaps she was mourning not just the loss of the man she loved, but the loss of the one person who truly knew who she was behind the crown and the costume. With Dudley gone, Elizabeth was utterly alone with her secret. Now let's talk about the physical evidence that supports the Bisley Boy theory. Because there's more than just suspicious behavior and convenient explanations. There are actual documented observations from people who saw Elizabeth up close. And many of these observations are genuinely strange when you examine them carefully. Start with her appearance. Elizabeth was obsessed with controlling her image to a degree that went far beyond normal royal vanity. She owned an enormous collection of wigs, hundreds of them in various shades of red and blonde, which she wore constantly throughout her adult life. The official explanation is that this was fashionable and helped her maintain the appearance of youthful red hair as she aged. But the Bisley Boy theory suggests another reason. She was covering male pattern baldness. Men lose their hair in distinctive patterns as they age, patterns that would have been obvious and inexplicable on someone supposedly female. Wigs solved this problem completely. Similarly, Elizabeth was famous for her thick white makeup, Venetian ceruse, a toxic paste made from white lead and vinegar that she applied so heavily it looked like a mask. This makeup became her signature look, the ghostly white face with heavily rouged lips that appears in all her portraits. The standard explanation is that pale skin was fashionable, a sign that you didn't have to work outdoors like common people. But the Bisley Boy theory suggests the makeup served a more practical purpose, hiding masculine features like stronger jawlines, facial hair growth, or skin texture that didn't quite match female norms. The lead in the makeup was slowly poisoning her, eating away at her skin. But perhaps she considered that an acceptable price for maintaining the disguise. Then there's the matter of her clothing. Elizabeth wore enormous gowns with extensive padding and structure, dresses that completely concealed the shape of her body beneath layers of fabric, boning, and decoration. She favored high necklines that covered her throat completely, hiding her Adam's apple. These fashion choices were typical for the era, but Elizabeth took them to extremes, wearing more padding, more structure, more coverage than other women of her time. Was this just personal preference, or was she hiding a masculine body shape that might betray her if anyone saw too much? Multiple foreign ambassadors, trained observers whose job was to study Elizabeth carefully and report every detail back to their governments, noted that something seemed unusual about the Queen's appearance. A Venetian ambassador wrote that Elizabeth had a surprisingly deep voice and a masculine manner of speaking that didn't match the high, soft voices expected of women. Another diplomat described her as having the bearing of a soldier rather than a lady, noting how she strode through rooms with long, confident steps instead of the gliding walk that noble women were taught from childhood. The Spanish ambassador went even further, writing in an encrypted dispatch that Elizabeth's form is not as other women's. A deliberately vague phrase that could mean almost anything, but clearly indicated something physical that struck him as wrong. This ambassador was immediately recalled to Spain after sending this report. His diplomatic career effectively ended by a single sentence. What had he seen that was so shocking, it got him pulled from his post? These weren't people trying to slander Elizabeth or undermine her reputation. They were professional diplomats who needed accurate information about a potential marriage partner for their royal masters. They had every incentive to describe Elizabeth favorably, yet they kept noting these strange masculine characteristics that didn't quite fit. Elizabeth's behavior around doctors and medical examinations also fits the Bisley Boy pattern. She was incredibly secretive about her body, refusing to allow any physicians to examine her, except for a tiny circle of trusted doctors who had served her for years. When she fell seriously ill in 1566, so sick that everyone thought she was dying, her physicians begged for permission to conduct a proper examination. She finally agreed because the situation was so desperate, but only her personal physician, Dr. Hewick, was allowed to see her. When he emerged from her chambers after the examination, witnesses reported that he looked deeply shaken, pale and trembling, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He refused to discuss what he had observed beyond the bare minimum needed for treatment. Within a year, Dr. Hewick was dead from what the records vaguely call sudden fever. His medical notes disappeared completely. What had he seen during that examination that disturbed him so profoundly? The Bisley Boy theory suggests he had discovered the anatomical truth and couldn't cope with the implications. Most tellingly, Elizabeth left explicit written instructions that there was to be no post-mortem examination of her body after death. This was highly unusual for a monarch. Autopsies were standard practice to determine cause of death and document the medical history of royal persons. Yet Elizabeth specifically forbade it, making her wishes clear in her final instructions. Why would she be so concerned about doctors examining her corpse if there was nothing unusual to find? Then there's the matter of her education and intelligence. Roger Ascham, Elizabeth's tutor, wrote extensively about his royal student, and his descriptions are fascinating through the Bisley Boy lens. He praised her constantly, describing her as having a mind exempt from female weakness and possessing a masculine power of application to her studies. He marveled at how quickly she mastered languages, how deeply she understood political philosophy, how naturally she grasped military strategy. Now, Ascham probably didn't mean these as literal descriptions of gender. He was using the language of his time to praise a highly intelligent woman by comparing her to male scholars. But the Bisley Boy theory asks, what if he was being more literal than we realize? What if he noticed that his student learned differently from other girls he had taught, thought differently, approached problems differently? Ascham had educated many noble children, both boys and girls, and he would have noticed if Elizabeth's learning patterns matched male students more closely than female ones. Elizabeth's famous speech to the troops at Tilbury in 1588 before the Spanish Armada battle contains one of the most quoted lines in English history. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Oi? Why phrase it exactly this way? Why explicitly reference having a woman's body while claiming a king's spirit? The Bisley Boy theory suggests this might have been a subtle confession, an inside joke for anyone who knew the truth, hiding the reality in plain sight where everyone could hear it, but nobody would understand the real meaning. Now we come to the most dramatic piece of physical evidence supporting the Bisley Boy legend, the coffin discovered in 1870. Over 300 years after Elizabeth's supposed childhood death, Reverend Thomas Keble was overseeing renovation work at Overcourt House in Bisley. The workers were digging in the garden below the window of the room where Princess Elizabeth had stayed during her time in the village. Their shovels struck stone, and when they cleared away the dirt, they found an old stone coffin buried in the garden. Keble ordered it opened. Inside was the skeleton of a young girl approximately 9 or 10 years old based on the bone structure. She was dressed in fragments of fine Tudor-era clothing, silk and brocade that had mostly rotted away, but still showed signs of having been expensive, high-quality fabric. She wore jewelry appropriate for someone of noble or royal status. The coffin's location directly beneath the window of Elizabeth's room was suggestive. The child's age matched what Elizabeth's would have been in 1543. The quality of the burial, stone coffin rather than a simple wooden box, indicated someone important. Reverend Keble believed he had found Princess Elizabeth's body, the real princess who had died, and been hidden away while a boy took her place. What did Keble do with this potentially explosive historical evidence? He examined the remains briefly, noted their discovery to his family, and then ordered the coffin reburied in an unmarked location. He claimed he didn't want the grave to become a shrine or attract unwanted attention. The body was buried again somewhere in Bisley, the exact location never recorded, and the evidence was lost forever. Critics argue that this is convenient for believers in the Bisley Boy theory. Without the body available for modern scientific examination, there's no way to prove or disprove whether the child in the coffin was actually Princess Elizabeth. But supporters of the theory point out that the discovery itself is significant, regardless of what happened afterward. Why would there be a child's body in a stone coffin, dressed in Tudor noble clothing, buried in the garden of the exact house where Princess Elizabeth stayed, unless something unusual had happened there? Ordinary deaths don't require secret burials in gardens. Bodies were buried in churchyards with proper ceremonies and markers. This burial was hidden, hasty, and meant to be forgotten. That suggests something that needed to be covered up quickly, which aligns perfectly with the legend of Elizabeth's death and hurried concealment. The timing of the discovery is also interesting. This happened in 1870 during the Victorian era, when another Elizabeth sat on the throne. Queen Victoria. The Victorians were obsessed with the Tudor period, and Elizabeth I in particular, seeing her as a proto-Victoria, a great queen who had ruled in her own right. But they were also deeply uncomfortable with any suggestion that Elizabeth might have been anything other than what she claimed. The idea that the Virgin Queen might have been male or intersex, or anything outside the strict gender binaries the Victorians held sacred, was deeply threatening to their worldview. Reverend Keble may have reburied the body precisely because proving the Bisley Boy theory true would have been too scandalous for Victorian society to handle. Better to leave the mystery unresolved than to destroy the image of one of England's greatest monarchs. But here's the truly chilling part. If the boy who replaced Princess Elizabeth did become queen and rule for 45 years, he did an extraordinary job of it. Elizabeth I was one of the most successful monarchs in English history. She defeated the Spanish Armada, established England as a major naval power, presided over a cultural golden age that produced Shakespeare and Marlowe, managed religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants with remarkable skill, and left England far stronger than she found it. If the Bisley Boy theory is true, it means a village boy with no training for monarchy, thrust into the role by desperate accident, became one of history's greatest rulers. That's almost harder to believe than the substitution itself. Yet it's part of what makes the legend so compelling. It suggests that greatness isn't about bloodline or destiny, but about the person inside, regardless of their origin or gender. Perhaps that's why the theory has endured for so long, why Bram Stoker devoted a chapter to it, why people still argue about it today. It challenges everything we think we know about royal legitimacy, gender, and power. And here's the final, most frustrating piece. We could actually test this theory definitively with modern science. Elizabeth I's tomb is in Westminster Abbey, sealed for over 400 years. DNA testing could determine gender. Bone structure analysis could reveal anatomical truth. Carbon dating and forensic examination could answer questions that have haunted historians for centuries. But every request to examine Elizabeth's remains has been denied. In 1952, historians petitioned to open the tomb during Elizabeth II's coronation. Denied. In 1975, when non-invasive scanning technology became available, denied. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of Elizabeth I's death, multiple universities offered to fund complete research with total discretion, denied. The official reason is always respect for the dead, but they opened Richard III's tomb, they examined Henry VIII, they've studied countless other historical figures. Why is Elizabeth I different? What are they so afraid we might find if we look inside that coffin? Subscribe to this channel if you believe it's finally time for Westminster Abbey to open that tomb and let science answer the questions history has been asking for 4 centuries. Hit the like button if you think the Bisley Boy theory explains too many coincidences to be completely dismissed. And drop a comment telling us your theory. Was Elizabeth I really a red-haired boy from a tiny village who pulled off the greatest deception in royal history? Or is there another explanation that makes sense of all these strange facts? Your insights might just uncover something historians have missed. After 400 years of secrets and sealed tombs, the truth deserves to see daylight.